Hi, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to another HR forum. We'll be discussing purpose today and how can we help our people to find purpose in their work. Thanks to the AmCham for organizing this platform for us. And I think we can start. We are waiting a few more people, but to be respectful to those of you who showed them time, we will start. So hello everyone again. I would say that last 2 years were quite turbulent. And it's almost fair to say that this pandemic rocked our world. We examined our values, our goals, our purpose on personal level, and many organizations were going through the same process. It would be great, nice, if the next year will finally bring some peace and quiet, but properly it will bring more transitions, more novelties. Some say we are going through great resignation. The other call it great reshuffle, but whatever it is, we as a labor market are quite aware that the market is volatile. The HR function is expected to come up with some strategy to have happy employees and happy businesses. And there are so many questions on the mind of us in the HR as we are wondering what our employees' needs are and what our companies can actually offer. Is it better salaries? Is it psychological safety, better work-life balance? Is it flexible work or office work? Amazing benefits? Should we put more effort to show that we as a company live in accordance of the proclaimed values, or that we are being responsible for our community and we're doing some great social and charitable work and that we take care for the environment? So many things. And I read somewhere that we are shifting from managing employee experience to managing a life experience of our employees. So should we ensure a stronger sense of purpose for our people? So with all these questions, I'm so glad that today we can welcome Dr. Brennan Jacoby, a philosopher who regularly works with so many questions and with businesses with the aim to help them think better. So Brennan, thanks for taking your time to join us today, especially for Thanksgiving. And it's really great to have you here with us.
Thank you so much, Ivana, and hello, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to get to be with you today, particularly on Thanksgiving, perhaps. I'm originally from the US, but I'm currently sat in London. So it's not a bank holiday here today, but I appreciate it nonetheless, and looking forward to the conversation.
I would like to start this conversation with a simple but provocative question. Should employees expect corporations to give them purpose?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting and, as you say, provocative question, Ivana. And I think in your preamble to today's session, you brought up so many rich pieces and angles to this. And so to come right in, I think you might all expect a philosopher to do this a little bit, but I have to say, I think it depends on what we mean by purpose. And I think that has shifted to some extent. But before I unpack that a little bit more, just briefly, I do also want to just simply answer the question. And so I think my answer to whether or not employees should expect the corporates to give them purpose is yes, but I think what we should be expecting of corporates is purpose, but with a smaller p than perhaps we were expecting before. What I mean by that is, again, getting into what we mean by purpose. Now, I think a lot of times these days, as I go around to different businesses and work with them. So as Ivana said, with my company called Philosophy at Work, we go into corporates and we do learning and development workshops on things like trust and psychological safety, decision-making, curiosity. And while I've been interacting with businesses, particularly over the last 18 months during the pandemic, what I've noticed is the way that employees are talking about purpose has shifted. Now, a lot of what we're understanding as purpose is really meaning and, for lack of a better term, goodness, sort of ethics. And so the other meaning that I think perhaps purpose has had before is a sort of reason to exist. I mean, in its most basic sense, that is what purpose is. And these days, I don't think employees should look to businesses for that so much. Indeed, during the pandemic, more and more employees were reminded of all the purpose that they have outside of their work. As I'm sure you will have encountered as well, many of our colleagues, many of the employees we work with, when they were working perhaps more from home, were reminded that the sort of purpose that they find in friends, family, the outdoors, pets, different hobbies and different things that perhaps they weren't giving as much time to before because of commuting and different things. While today we have more and more people sort of finding purpose outside of work, I think what they're still bringing, and this is why I say, yes, we should expect corporates to give us purpose, but it's a smaller P. It's just one part, one ingredient in the recipe of our purpose for living. And it boils down often to something like meaning, something like support. So just to round this out a little bit, I want to talk just for very briefly, and then I'll bring it back to you, Ivana, about something that the psychologist Adam Phillips has said. This is going back about 10 years or so, but he said that people are meaning-seeking beings. We're trying to find meaning in life. And he said throughout human history, perhaps in previous times, people brought their burden of meaning to perhaps organized religion, the local community. But then as we moved into the more recent sort of decades, many people were bringing their burden of meaning to work and to the corporate. And I think we're seeing a shift of that now, back away from the corporate and people finding meaning in their other aspects of their life. But that's not to say that they don't care about the purpose they're getting from their work. So my answer is, yes, I think we should be looking for some purpose in our work and from corporates to help us achieve that and get that from them. But what I think that looks like these days is support. We want to be working for a company that is supporting our own personal values, where I feel supported, that is helping take care of me in a way. And also while I'm doing work which is aligned with what I already care about. So quite a few things that link into, I suppose, what you introduced, Ivana, before, and a couple of things maybe to unpack as we go forward.
Yeah, well, when we were preparing for this conversation, you mentioned that after the pandemic,
I think there's a key distinction that will hopefully be helpful for us here on a very practical level. And it goes back to what we saw at the start of the pandemic. So sort of, or at least at the time when so many businesses were scrambling to work out how they were going to manage everyone sort of from home, or for the most part. I know that's not across the board, but so many more of us were working from home in a distributed way. And what really struck me in that period, and what came out in a lot of the sessions we were doing, was there was a view that if we just got the physical logistics right, then we would be all set. And I think that same assumption is relevant here. So if you think back to 2 years ago, 18 months ago, there was an expectation, or there seemed to be an assumption that as long as we get everyone set up on Zoom or Teams and everyone has machinery and we sort of get the tech right from home, then we're set up for virtual working. We're set up for remote distributed working. And of course, what we found is that it's not just about those logistical matters. It's about how you are together. It's about how you include people that are now working from a home office, how you connect with each other. And of course, the tech supports that to some extent, but it's much more about those soft skills, those human skills, the way of understanding and listening and connecting with people that made the big difference at the start of the pandemic. And so to come back to your question, I think there's a similar distinction going on there. I think today there's a lot of talk about, getting the flexible working right, working out how many days to be in the office and out of the office, and how do we do the logistics so that the right people are in the office at the same time, and this sort of thing. And that is all very important. I acknowledge that, but I think we would be missing a trick. And there's a risk of us sliding into the same assumption that we had at the start of the pandemic if we didn't say, those are in some ways logistics, those are in some ways working out how we work, but there's a lot more important work to be done around how we are together. And that means, how do we listen to each other, which is, of course, relevant to flexible working. One of the issues around working out your flexible working policy is, how well are you listening to people? Are you showing your employees that you care about them, you support them? That's all relevant. But I guess here what I'm concerned about us focusing on is thinking about the degree to which we're not just focusing on getting the structure right, but we're also really working hard on how are we together? How do we navigate this and recognize each other's agency? How do we respect each other? How do we listen to each other? Because all of that stuff, if you get that right, people will be very forgiving when it comes to bumps and mistakes around when to be in the office and not.
Absolutely. I think it would be easy if we had someone to tell us what to do, but we are, as I mentioned, in a period of examinations and finding the ways that are best for our teams and our companies and our culture and our business. So can you tell me, being someone who who should help businesses to think more clearly, what are the questions that we should consider in our businesses to take this, forward a bit, to have like a clear picture, what would be the best approach for our people and our teams?
Yeah, great, thank you. And before, there are some specific questions that I think can be very beneficial for us all to be asking, but perhaps more, and I'll come to those in a moment, but maybe more important than the questions that I would suggest is more the structure in which we're all crafting our own questions. Because I think what makes for a really good question, a really effective one, is very context sensitive, and it's very much in the intent, the tone of the question. So as you know, when we run workshops on curiosity and how the practice of asking great questions and how sort of leaders, managers really go about doing that, there are 4 components that I think emerge from all the research around curiosity and questions. And those are, we want to be asking questions, particularly at this time, but I think these extend more broadly as well. We want to be asking questions which are authentic, first of all. So they come from a real place of authentic curiosity. They should be bold. So they may be contentious, but they're thirdly vital. So they're authentic, bold, and vital. They need to be asked at this time. And lastly, they're not judgmental. And I think it's important to say this because otherwise, I think we can be using questions as a transaction, as a transactional tool to try to just get from the employees what we need to know so that we can keep the show on the road. And actually, instead, I think we need to be using our curiosity and asking questions to do real work. So, when you say, as you say, working with businesses on how we think and thinking our best, a lot of times what that means is slowing down to reflect well, checking our thinking, doing critical thinking on our ways of working, how any assumptions running in the background. And so if we're saying, well, what are the questions we need to be asking right now to get this right? The first thing I would say is, whatever questions we ask, let's make sure that we're not wasting time, because this is very urgent. Let's make sure we're not wasting time on questions which are not authentic, because I think that's going to show through very easily to employees. Let's ask questions that really matter, and let's ask questions that are perhaps requiring of courage, that are bold. So some of the ones that I think corporates should be asking, and particularly in HR, are things like, where do our values show up for our employees? So we say we have these values, and I'm sure they're the right ones. As you said, there's been a lot of sort of soul searching and processing of values over the last couple of years, and rightly so. And the age-old challenge for corporate values is always, have we got the right ones? But then also, how do we connect the dots between what they are and the difference they actually make? But part of what's going on right now is potentially a mismatch between what we see as the right values and see them doing work for the business, and what our teams see. And so the questions, I think, is one of asking our employees, what is your experience right now? Do you feel like the ways of working, what's been most important at the core of this business, or at the core of this team, or this division, or area of work, do you feel like that's still right? Or do you think we might be shifting things? Now that, I suppose what I'm suggesting is a very a sort of market research, internal listening campaign. And that's why I say I think it needs to be context sensitive and relevant to each business's context, so that you can say, that some of us might say, well, that's not really appropriate for where we are right now. But you might find a way to make that kind of question your own, and sit really well. So that question of what work are our values really doing right now? And then the other question of how, what lines of communication do we have open right now, so that we can be really responsive to employees, so that as soon as they're feeling like, you know what, I feel really conflicted with how my life is now and how my work is now, you're able to, first of all, recognize that and then respond very quickly. Because the last thing, it's one thing to have issues. Everyone has issues. But what we don't want is for people to be unaware of those issues. So the faster that we can pick them up. So how are our values doing? Where are they showing up? How are we open to hearing and having those lines of communication? And then also, how is our culture been impacted? And one last thing I'll say here, and then I'm interested to see how you'd like to move on. But something else I've noticed just recently in the last few months really is I don't know quite how to articulate it, but there seems to be a difficulty with across the board, across different industries that I've been working with, different hierarchies and things. There seems to be a difficulty to switch out of sort of crisis mode, or switch out of just being focused on optimization. So, 2 years ago, 18 months ago, we all had to switch into only focus on what really needs to be done because we're putting out fires, and let's be really strategic in that way. But then now what I've been finding is people going, do you know what? Yes, I could meet up with someone for a face-to-face conversation that's going to be really valuable for our culture, for their sense of feeling valued. But gosh, the amount of time I would use to travel, I could be getting so many other things done. And actually, the person I report to is expecting me to get all that stuff done. And so in our businesses, there's been a whole shift of expectations around how much work we should be expected to get done in a certain amount of time. And there's been a shift really in what's important. And so whereas before we would just accept that there would be a bit of travel involved, and that you would have maybe a sit-down meeting face-to-face with coffee, tea, whatever. Now I've been noticing less of that and opting instead for a hyper efficiency, a sort of optimization. And so I think we need to have a conversation about how we appreciate that optimization, because we've been able to do a lot of great work at speed as a result. But then how do we find ways to just check in with our sense of what's important and bring back in some of those things that are really important, but maybe not as urgent, and build back in some of those relational things. So I think, so to come back, a question there is, what are our, what's most important to us right now? Is it just getting stuff done? Or is it, where do relationships fit in that?
Well, from here, I would like to lead in two directions, but let's take one step at a time. I'm really interested in values, in a sense. Do you have some advice for companies how to find their authentic appeal? What I mean about that is that we've seen in practice this terrible urge, to come up with a great story, to improve our employer branding. And I think some companies are, really risking slipping into generic stories that, we care, we are, integrity, or, typical values that we encounter. What would be, we discussed that several times you mentioned authenticity. So what should we be, looking for and asking in our organizations to be really honest with ourselves and to be able to shape a truly authentic story?
That's a really hard question. I think it's the right question. Thank you. But I think I'd say it's hard because, this is just one view among many, I think, but I've always thought that authentic purpose and authentic values need to have integrity. That's another way of talking about authenticity, is integrity. And what I mean by that is not integrity in the sense of being a trustworthy person or something, or a trustworthy brand, but having being joined up and having your brand narrative, your internal marketing, be consistent and follow directly from the point of whatever it is you're doing, right? So if there's a disconnect, if there's a lack of integrity between what we say we care about and maybe really do care about, but the products we make, or the policies we have for handling disputes internally, or flexible working, if there's a mismatch, then it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter still, but it's going to be less effective no matter how much we get the language right, and say the right sounding things. And I suppose all I'm really saying is supporting your point of, yes, it needs to be authentic, and that authenticity means joined up right through the core of our ways of working and our products, or whatever it is, our services that we're making. But so how do we do that? And particularly, how do we check that we're not just saying the right things, but that we have that? I think there's, if I'm understanding you right, something that would hopefully be helpful to us as a group is to have some sort of process that we could go through, even as individuals, but ideally as a team, to sort of say, let's check in. We say that we care about these things, but is that really true? Do we have that integrity? And so I want to suggest one thing that can be useful as a way of doing this. And it's rooted in one approach to practical ethics. Now, the reason I'm bringing in practical ethics is because if we're talking about authentic values, well, the work of values is to guide us in how to make tough choices, and to say these are the things we care about, and these things guide how we navigate the work we do. The reason that we say, oh, this business is a good business because we like their values. We assume that those values are going to shape how they live, right? And the way you live is a matter of practical ethics. How do you choose to say this is good and that's not good, and live your life? And the reason I think this is helpful is that there's a lot of really rich, very practical work that comes out of the philosophical tradition of practical ethics. One thing in particular is this view that all tough choices, all sort of tricky things that we're navigating, are essentially tensions between good things that we can't do both of. So we have a right, something that is right, and another thing that's right, and we can't do both of them. It's a right versus right situation. Now, just to signpost where I'm going with this, I think what businesses need to be doing in order to check the authenticity of their values is to look through their policies, look through their ways of working, look through their messaging, and consider, where are there tensions where we might, there might be two good things that we're having to navigate, and we can't do both of them. We want to do for example, we want to do what's right in the short term now for our stakeholders, our shareholders, our employees, but we also want to do what's good in the long term for the climate or the communities in which we work, or even just for the business and our employees in the long term as well. We can't sometimes do at the same time what's best for the short term and the long term. Now, our values, if they're the right ones and if they're the authentic ones, they should have something to say. They should help us navigate that tension. So if we say we care about inclusivity, and we're trying to say, well, we want to do what's right for our stakeholders in the short term. We also want to do what's right for our employees in the long term. Well, we don't just come to that in a vacuum. We come to that as a business that says we value inclusivity. So how does that inform? Well, that might tip the scales towards acting in a way that favors the longer term story for the employees. And that's a useful thing to do. Other tensions that come in the world of practical ethics is, short-term versus long-term, justice versus mercy. That's another classic tension that we look at in philosophy and in ethics. And for example, you might sit down and say, do our policies around, employee behavior or disputes, do they just emphasize justice, or do they also acknowledge and leave room for mercy? And if what we find when we look at our policies is, do you know what, they're pretty focused just on justice and following the rules and doing the right thing, there's not a lot of room for mercy. Well, then does that work for us? Is there integrity between that and a value that we have that maybe says we care about people, or we do something like that? So I guess it's I'm trying to provide an answer that I hope is substantive, but it's not simple. And what I'm saying is, I think for us to work out whether or not our values are authentic and to have that really clear narrative, the work we need to do is to have on a piece of paper, bring out our values, and then look at our policies and say, where are they joined up? And where is there some questions about what it really means for that value to show up? And as we navigate those tensions. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm doing something.
It makes sense. I don't think we can get. I don't think we can get the answers like in conversation in half an hour, but we can get a useful kind of inspiration of the things that we should ponder on. And another question that came to my mind. You mentioned that we are still kind of in a crisis mode of operations. But I'm pretty sure so many ways are here to stay with us, like flexible work and those, as you mentioned, two good things. It's a good thing to be more productive, and it's a good thing to see each other. But one is losing at the moment. From your experience in the UK market and with your clients you're working with, and big businesses, etc. What do you see as a trend that will actually win? Is it, in this case, is it productive working and maybe work-life balance, or seeing each other and things like that? What do you think in the market is the situation right now?
Yeah. So I think if we do nothing, what will win is isolation. That is, and that maybe that's too dramatic or too black and white. What I mean is, well, so let me tell you a little story. I live out near Oxford, and I got the train into London today. And I don't do that very much anymore. I used to do it 4 days a week. So today's train ride was the first time in 6 weeks or something. And it was really noticeable that through looking at behavior of people on the very full train, that as a group, the people on the train had regressed, I would say, in their social sensitivity. So, in the quiet carriage where you're supposed to sort of not have any talking, no phone calls, there were quite a few people on Zoom calls talking at full voices and things where you would have never had that before. And I think that's a very small example of the elevation of a shift in values, where what we're saying is most important is the call that I've organized right now, the work that I do primarily as me and my machine, right? I've got these calls to do. I'm going to dial into that, and I'm not as concerned as I used to be for those people around me, right? Because we spent so much time by ourselves. And so I think there's, another example, I've been doing a program for a client where at the start of the year, we said, or at the start of the autumn, I should say, we said, everyone's going to work at home, but every 1 day a week, everyone's going to come into the office, and we're going to have these together days. And this is our time to sort of bond and do culture things and everything. And then on the first day that we were meant to all come together, the HR director said, I think our numbers are going to be quite low because so-and-so is expecting a new couch to be delivered today, so they had to stay home. And this person is off for another reason, and this person is, and so there's a shift of power that we've all been noticing, where it's harder to say you have to be in the office, but then also there's a shift towards, well, actually, I'm quite comfortable with receiving deliveries and things at home, and I can still do my job from home. So I'm not going to come in today. And there's a more of a boldness in that way. And so I think if we don't do anything positive, then I think that what I called isolation, or we could say sort of a more of a hyper individualism, could stay for a longer term. And I think we've already seen some of the detrimental sides of that. As much as people, I too, I like working from home. I like the comforts of home and all those sorts of things. At the same time, we also know that, it can feel lonely, and there's a need to connect, and our resilience can be impacted. Of course, the different personalities have different needs. Some of us have really been more resilient and thrived because we really like that alone time, and it's not isolation, it's solitude. So I'm speaking generally, but I think that's one that I see, if just allowed to be creatures of habit and go, I think that could keep running. But at the same time, there's so much interesting effort being done to try to really intelligently and intentionally address that I'm hopeful that in the coming months, we will continue working this out. I think the working out that we're all doing, in this session, in our businesses, is really, really good. And that we should try to sit with that discomfort for a little bit longer, as long as we can, because it's very fertile ground right now, because we're having to have these conversations and hear from our employees and work on it. That's a really good place, I think, to be, as uncomfortable as it can be. So I guess I'm not really, I don't specialize in seeing the future, but I would say, if left to ourselves, that solitude is probably going to continue. But at the same time, I'm hopeful that there's going to be some useful initiatives, some ways of saying, do you know what? Yes, let's do all of that. Let's find what's actually best in a much more individualized way. This member of the team needs to be home in these ways, but also wants to connect in these ways too. And it'll shake down, and we'll find a way to support everyone in that context.
Thank you so much. I mean, I have so many questions, like all the time when I talk to you. As we said, we want to be, practical and to engage our participants as well. So my last question in this part of our forum today would be, what can HR as a function do to create that corporate culture that would be helpful for the business and the current needs of employees, and of course the future?
Yeah. So here, maybe I'll just back up for a second and say I think a lot of certainly what I've shared today, a lot of it has been, I've been sort of suggesting we need to go out and talk to the employees, go out and listen, and there's been a lot of my answers have focused on engagement, but of course that engagement is only going to be fruitful if the people that we're engaging feel safe to engage with us. And so something that you mentioned at the top of the session, excuse me, specifically psychological safety is, I think, central to all of this. That's something, you said before, that I work with groups on how they think. And a lot of times before we do anything around critical thinking or anything like that, we'll do sessions on psychological safety, because I know that we don't think our best if we don't feel safe. We know that on a sort of neurological level, our prefrontal cortex doesn't fire as well and all this sort of stuff. So, also we know that if we don't cultivate a culture of psychological safety, then we could do all that listening. We could try to all different policies, but it's going to fall flat, I think. And so I would say the piece around cultivating a culture of psychological safety is really important. And I think there's some really practical things we can do to do that. Probably everyone in the room will have their own preferences for how to cultivate that. But I have some thoughts on and some things that I could share that is what I normally work with people on to do just that. So I don't know if that's something we should unpack at this moment. But
yes, please.
Okay.
Great.
So, I mean, and one thing that comes to mind, and it's really, really simple, but it goes right back to the work of a psychology professor in Washington State named Dr. John Gottman. And I'll just write that name in the chat in case anyone's interested in seeing the spelling. But John Gottman is a psychology professor, and he has something that's been called the Love Lab. And I'll just tell you about this very briefly because it explains the tool that I'm going to share with you. And I think it's really important to understand why the tool works so that in our own context and as the world changes, we're able to flex the tool to that context. So Gottman has this place that's been dubbed, not by him, but by other people, the Love Lab. And what it is it's an apartment, a flat. There's a bedroom, bathroom, living room, kitchen, all the sort of normal things we'd expect. But it's all wired for sound and video. Now there's no cameras and microphones in the bedroom and bathroom, but everywhere else there is. And he and his team have couples come and stay in the lab for weekends at a time. And they have those couples come back year after year, and then they analyze everything that they do. And because he and his team have been doing this for 40 years, they have a very rich evidence base, and they've gotten very, very good at picking which couples are going to stay together and which ones are going to break up, even from very early on in the study, in the relationship. So if it just, I should say, if anyone's interested for their own own needs, his book is called The Relationship Cure. It's really interesting. I'd highly recommend it. I did my PhD on the topic of trust, and so I've read a lot of books about trust, and a lot of them are nice, but they're kind of theoretical, whereas his gives you some really substantive data because he has that evidence base. But what he says the couples do is the same stuff that we find teams doing and managers doing in businesses where there's that climate of psychological safety that makes a space where we can make it through bumpy times, which is what we're talking about, I think. And so let me tell you very briefly what the couples do, and then we can connect the dots to the corporate context. The things that Gottman says the couples do that make it, the couples that stay together, is two things. First of all, they notice what he calls sliding door moments. And this is a moment where, in his words, someone puts in a bid for your attention. It's like they're passing a ball to you and they're wanting to know, are you going to catch it and pass it back to me in a way that's going to allow for me to catch it? So for example, if you're at home and you're making some tea or something, a friend or your partner walks into the room and sort of sighs heavily in your direction. That might be a sliding door moment where, if you know them, maybe they are not just sighing, they're sort of wanting you to turn towards them and say, are you okay? Do you want to talk about something? Or another sliding door moment in the more sort of traditional office kind of context is someone stops by your desk and says, can we talk about something? Or I'm really struggling with this project. Or maybe they send you a Slack message or an email or something that says, you say, how are you doing? And they send you a message back going, oh, lots on. Okay, now that's maybe just normal speak for just saying I'm kind of busy, but maybe that's them dipping their toe in the water, sort of going, is it okay for me to acknowledge that I'm maybe not being brilliant right now? And now the couples that make it in Gottman studies, first of all, are really good at noticing those kinds of relationally significant moments. They're able to pick up what's running in the background. When they get an email that says, I'm busy, can we talk about this project? They don't just read the details of the text. They read the subtext in the background that is relationally and emotionally significant. Now, that's not the only thing they do. They notice those moments, and then more often than not, in those moments, they choose to turn towards the other person. Now, it may be a physical turning towards to talk to them, or it may be something that's much more implicit. So, in the tea example, turning towards might be saying, are you okay? Do you want to talk about something? Staying neutral would just be sort of pretending that you didn't hear the sigh and making your tea. And turning against would be saying something like, can you please keep it down? This is my one moment of Zen, or something, I'm trying to make a cup of tea. Now, the couples that stayed neutral or turned away did not have psychological safety, and their relationships did not fare as well. So too, in the corporate context, in order to cultivate these kinds of climates, my suggestion is we need to be looking for those sliding door moments and helping the team leaders that we support, the people that we're working with, be better at spotting those as well. And then help us first, and then help them work out ways of authentically turning towards each other. So, a question maybe for us to discuss is, what are the sliding door moments that we have? It might be people sending us those messages about being busy, or actually I would suggest that, the great resignation or reshuffle, or whatever you want to call it, is one big sliding door moment. It's an opportunity to have very meaningful conversations with people about themselves, about work. But then the question is, what does it mean to turn towards? Now, I could say one example of turning towards would be to say, yes, I'm going to shut the computer and we can talk about this for a few minutes. Or yes, let's book in time to have a really useful conversation about your needs right now and how we can make work really work for you. But maybe that doesn't feel authentic to you. And so that's why I think the useful thing for us as individuals is to sit down and make a list of what are the sliding door moments, the kinds of sliding door moments that we're being presented with right now. And then what would it look like for me to turn towards other people? Because it's simple, but that's really what makes the difference, because that's what makes people feel safe. And that's because trust ultimately, and trustworthiness, is based on showing others that we see them and that we care about what we're seeing. So it's a little bit in a nutshell, but maybe something we can pick up as well.
Yeah, well, now I would like to invite everyone to actually network a bit and discuss a bit in small groups. So this is something new we will be doing. As at the start of this conversation with Brennan, I said how I miss networking part of our meetings. So we came up with the idea to, go into small breakout rooms, chat a little bit about, sliding door moments or just whatever you would like. And then Brennan, like 5 minutes or so, you think it's good. And then we'll all come together. We want to have everyone be engaged a bit more, not to just have you listening to a podcast, but just really be able to network with your colleagues. So, Brennan, can you organize the breakout rooms for us?
Yeah, thank you very much.
See you in 5 minutes here.
Perfect. So I've created the breakout rooms, everyone, and just to let you know, I'm assuming that by this point in your lives, you've been in a breakout room on Zoom before. But just to let you know, I'm letting Zoom randomly assign you, so don't read too much into the people that you're with. You'll be in a room with 3 or 4 other colleagues. And if it should just move you over, but if not, you may have a little button at the bottom of your screen that you need to click to say join. So we'll see you back here in just a few minutes. Thank you very much, everyone. See you soon.
Everyone, I hope you enjoyed this short networking breakout rooms. We've noticed that more than half actually ran away. Didn't feel like quite like talking. I think this effect of isolation is showing up in HR forum as well. I hope you had a nice discussion. And we also wanted to do a poll and see, within this group, what do you think are our priorities when it comes to future and how we organize, purpose or, whatever. So, Cham, if I can ask you to run the first poll. And Cham, do we have enough so we can run the second poll? And Cham, can we run the second poll? Bane, do we have some technical problems or? Okay, let's leave it to Cham to resolve. And I would invite you, if you have any questions for Brennan, to raise them, and we'll check with Cham what happened. Oh, this is the second poll. Okay. So, Cham, when you get the results, you can pull them up and we can maybe discuss them a bit. Or, if you have any questions for Brennan, please do ask.
Just in the meantime, Ivana, well, maybe people are processing and thinking. It's great to see on this second poll question. It's great to see so much alignment with really what we're talking about, doing purposeful, value-driven work. But also, I love that there's votes for saying yes, we're going to provide interesting projects for people. I think that's very positive and constructive at this time as well. And also, I think we only saw the results from the first poll for a moment, but noticing that there was again a lot of the tendency in the group today was towards those same two pieces, doing things that are good for the environment, doing things which are value driven are most important. And that's not surprising, but it maybe suggests to me, because those are in line with what the sort of studies of employee data are saying as well. It reminds me that we and all our HR colleagues are employees too. We are people as well, and so I think we have a rich well sort of in us to draw on when we're trying to work out what's best for others, by thinking, well, not just what's best for us, but how would it be to use empathy, I suppose? What would it be like for us if we were there? Of course, there's difference of opinion, there's different people, the different priorities, different personalities, but there's a lot of the alignment between these answers and the general trajectory globally at this moment is interesting.
Absolutely. I think there is sometimes there is a contradiction between what we think would the employees want and what they actually want. And we need to ask questions on both levels. And we have one question from in the chat. So is how to approach this topic, having in mind it can be quite philosophic to the business, at the same time quite vital in these times.
Yeah, and just to check that I'm understanding the question correctly, are we saying here, how do we make what we're talking about really practical?
Absolutely.
Because it can sometimes feel like it's quite abstract, and I think that's always the challenge when we're talking about things which they're so complex and big that the way to wrap our heads around them is in a conceptual way. So purpose and values, we talk around these things in a philosophical way, but then of course the reason we're doing that is to get clearer on them so that we can actually do something about it. And I think a really practical way to get started to make a difference on them, rather than just saying, okay, I'm going to sit down myself and ask some of those questions we were talking about before, or sit down with my leadership team and discuss them. Though I think those are practical steps that we can do, is to actually, the first step I would say is to have those conversations where you're saying, okay, team, what is our purpose? How would we articulate that? I'm doing some work right now with a brand which they're finding a lot of value in getting their leadership team together and doing just that. What do we mean when we talk about these values? What do we really mean? What does that really look like? And they're writing down specific, tangible examples of this is where we see that showing up. And finding the difficulty of that exercise is quite illuminating for them in a practical way. But if that doesn't feel practical enough, then I think that other point around sliding door moments, I think that's highly practical. Being able to say, where are my team, my most immediate colleagues, where are they putting in bids for my attention? And how can I walk through my day today? How do I navigate it today through that lens? How do I say, okay, instead of this just being a meeting about a project or something transactional, how can I listen to what the person is saying to me right now as putting in a bid for attention? So, for example, if I were to say, well, Brennan, okay, do that right now with that question, rather than just saying, okay, I've got to give some answer. Maybe, if we were colleagues and we were working together, I would want to come back with more of a question and say, can you tell me more about where the importance of that question really is? I would imagine some of it is, gosh, this stuff is so important, and there's a real pressure for us just to get doing something because it feels so urgent. And so I would say, well, if that's true, then needing to find ways to turn towards each other and go, I also feel like we need to do something about it. So a very practical thing is practicing active listening in that way and saying, yes, I agree with you. Now, when it comes to, if the question is, what do we do at a sort of policy level? Some of the things that I've been seeing work very well is building in, which I'm sure all of you have done by this point, but building in sort of listening exercises where you're actually working with small groups of colleagues, of employees to say, what is your experience right now? Doing those sort of employee engagement work. That's a very important first step. But then if that's already been done, the practical step then next is to say, okay, so what are we saying we're going to do as a result of that employee engagement? Write that down. And then now, how does that align with our values? If it doesn't align, does the list of what we're going to do need to change? Or does the values, do one of the things that we state as our values need to change? And I would say these are still, to some extent, conceptual, but I think they're very practical, because they're practical as long as you do something about the answer that you find. If we just use it as a thought exercise, then it's potentially a waste of time and at best interesting. But if we say the results that we find from our employee engagement survey and what we say we're going to do about it, if we actually deliver on that, and then when we find that there's issues with delivering that, we go back to the drawing board and we work them out, then that's suddenly very, very practical.
Thank you, Brennan. I'm conscious about the time, that you have obligations after this, and thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you, and again, happy Thanksgiving. And I hope that our participants will find some of the ideas useful and practical. Thank you all. All of you for taking your time and joining us today, and see you soon on some next HR forum. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.